Among the differences between Edwards' views on freedom and those of the early Reformed tradition, perhaps the most primary point concerns the basic language of freedom itself, where the older tradition consistently presented the problem in terms of free choice, liberum arbitrium, understood as an interactive act of intellect and will, often, by the way, noting that the liberum part comes from the will, the voluntary part. The arbitrium, what we call choice, or the judgment, the arbitration, is done by the intellect in conjunction with the will. In other words, the older Reformed theology followed a traditional faculty psychology, where Edwards did not. The older tradition understood that there had to be a root indifference prior to the engagement of will and intellect, defined by the potency of the will to multiple effects, characterized by freedom of contradiction and freedom of contrariety in order for there to be free choice. Contingency is defined by them as the possibility there can be something other, the possibility that something could be otherwise, or in the case of the will, as a case of multiple potencies in its choosing. Edwards' formulation not only denies those points, it associates them with Arminianism. The shift in language between the older Reformed orthodoxy and the teachings of Edwards was identified by both proponents and opponents of his views, as was the background of Edwards' philosophy in the rationalist tradition of Hobbes and Locke. The issue of Edwards' heresy or orthodoxy isn't one that a historian can answer, given the absence of any synodical decisions on this matter. What can be said from a historical perspective, and to my mind the far more important issue, is that Edwards' views genuinely differ from those belonging to the Reformed tradition in the 16th and 17th centuries, whether one looks to Calvin or Turretin or the Westminster Standards. And that despite this lack of consonance, indeed, despite the acknowledged background of his thought in Hobbes and Locke, his views on freedom of will were absorbed, I hesitate to say hook, line, and sinker, by one branch of the Reformed tradition. It is then to Edwards and those who followed him in his path that Reformed theology owes much of its reputation for being a form of determinism or compatibilism, rather than to the theologians of the time of Calvin or the time of Turretin or the time of Maastricht, who have typically been viewed as arbiters of Reformed orthodoxy. The conclusion is then that there has indeed been a parting of ways in the Reformed tradition. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Muller, for an intriguing, counterintuitive lecture. I think we'll have a good time of Q&A. Let me invite you, if you have a question, please to come up to one of the microphones. And again, prepare to identify yourself briefly and pose your question briefly. Maybe just to prime the pump a little bit. I'll start. I have some questions about the main argument of your paper, but one of the things I like about it is that it affirms, it's going to sound like a self-centered comment, but I guess it is. It affirms something that I've been suggesting for a long time in a different way, and that is that Edwards' view of the freedom of the will does continue a parting of ways in the Reformed tradition that is present among Amyraldians in the 17th century and that is condemned in the Helvetic Formula Consensus by a synodical decision in 1675, that the argument of freedom of the will is premised on this basic distinction between what Edwards and the Amyraldians had called natural ability versus moral inability.
Okay.
So Edwardsian necessitarianism is a moral necessitarianism as distinguished from natural necessitarianism. Well, of course, Francis Turretin, who was one of Edwards' favorites, really did not like this distinction as he found it in Saumur in the 17th century and contributed to its condemnation in the Helvetic Formula Consensus, I think Canons 21 and 22 in 1675. So whether or not Edwards is doing exactly what these predecessors had done, and he is doing this in a very different context for a very different set of reasons, the most basic element of his argument, this distinction between natural and moral ability, had been condemned, and had been condemned by people that he recommended that his students read. One of these strange ironies of Reformed theological history. I see, even though I developed a long-winded comment to give you time to make it to the microphones, nobody is at a microphone yet. How about this counterintuitive part of your lecture?
What was counterintuitive? I'm not sure.
Well,
I had
Edwards' three main interlocutors in the Treatise on the Freedom of the Will, Thomas Chubb, Daniel Whitby, Isaac Watts, all seem to think that the older Calvinists were more necessitarian, and Edwards is responding to them and kind of redefining a way of thinking about the will in response to these criticisms of old Calvinism. I think most people would tend to believe, whether rightly or not, and you know more than anybody in this room, so maybe wrongly, that the older Calvinists were more necessitarian. They had a more absolutist understanding of predestination, foreordination, what that meant. So is there really contingency? And as you go scholastic and talk about contingency only in terms of secondary causes, does that do full justice to what the critics seem to want? I mean, that seems to me to be the counterintuitive part. But we'll trust you on what the old Calvinists were really after.
Yeah, the part of the problem, and I think this is the difficulty that Edwards is confronting, and it's a difficulty of everyone in his time. By the time you get to the middle of the 18th century, theology and philosophy by that time have largely gone over into the vernacular. There's not nearly as much teaching in the old language anymore, and it was probably agreed on by almost everyone that what one can vaguely call Aristotelianism, traditional Aristotelianism, Christian Aristotelianism, was non-functional, and it had been set aside. Once it's set aside and the language passes into the vernacular, you've lost two pillars of expression that were there in the 17th century. A highly nuanced older Aristotelianism that had been Christianized over the centuries, and Aristotle himself would have disowned it. So you simply have to call it by that name because it has a way of talking about substance, cause, and effect. That older philosophical language transferred into Latin, into church Latin, has a whole series of very refined distinctions, like this distinction between necessity of the consequence and necessity of the consequent thing. And those distinctions between primary actuality and secondary actuality. It also had a set of distinctions between understanding something in the divided sense and understanding in the composite sense. In sensu divisu, in sensu composito. Those distinctions enabled the 17th century writers to talk about freedom of human choosing in a way that's no longer available, even linguistically, in the 18th century. And it is not understood. The Arminians, like Whitby and company, are drawing the conclusion from a sovereign predestination that brings about the salvation of human beings, that Reformed theology means that human beings are not free. Edwards, in a sense, is buying the same conclusion. Whereas the older language, using those distinctions, using a fairly sophisticated language of providential concurrence that I must admit to my friend Sir Marquette, the Reformed did in fact borrow from the Thomists, able to argue a mutuality of divine and human willing, so that when God wills the salvation of an individual, he wills it in such a way, of course using grace, that the individual is also willing it. It's not a matter for the older Reformed theology that God is predestining you against your will to be dragged into God's salvation. No. God is predestining you in such a way, using his grace, that your will, in fact, as it is touched by grace, wills salvation. But the grace is radically prior. That's a case of a kind of determination. But the rest of the whole picture, I mean, when you read older Reformed theology on issues of free choice, they will say, because they're good scholastics, we need to say first, what is the state of the question and what is this debate about? It is not about the ability of human beings to act morally in a civil society. Everyone agrees to that. It is not about the freedom of human beings to have freedom of contradiction in everyday acts in life. There is no debate about that. Rather, it is about the ability of human beings to save themselves, to will their own salvation. And there is debate about that, and we assume they are not free to do that. There must be God's grace. And if you ask, how does that work? Well, there's this old scholastic assumption, which I think probably is just true, that all beings act according to their nature. And if your nature is sinful, you're going to act sinfully. And the older language of free choice, sin and moral acts assumes that you act freely according to your nature, which happens to be sinful. That means that everything you do is going to be sinful according to the nature of you. If I eat an apple, I'm going to do it sinfully. If I obey every commandment in the Decalogue, I am going to be obedient sinfully. And of course, if I commit sins, I'm going to commit them sinfully too. If I eat a pastrami sandwich, I'm going to do it quite sinfully. So that kind of language is there. Whitby didn't get it, and Edwards doesn't deal with that either. And there is a major philosophical shift there. George Hill is a good example of what's going on. George Hill says the older Calvinists just were, philosophically not well tuned. They were just inept philosophically, and we need to get by that. And now we've got Leibniz, Wolff, and good old 18th century metaphysical determinism. Well, Hill didn't understand how very carefully nuanced this older language was.
I think we have a question.
Thanks, Dr. Muller. One question that I had in my own mind was, like you'd mentioned, the state of the question. If what in your research or in your mind was different about the state of the question on the doctrine of necessity in Edwards' context versus the context of, say, Calvin, what were maybe some of the differences that may have led them to answer that question in a little bit different way?
So I do think it has to do with the loss of this whole older structure of language about necessity and contingency. Edwards makes a comment that contingency is the very opposite of necessity. Well, that's really quite true. If something is necessary, it has to be. If something is contingent, it doesn't have to be. The question that the older Reformed theology asks is, do all things have to be, and do they have to be in the same way? So there are some things that result from necessities of nature. Now, any older scholastic would tell you the necessities of nature are not absolute necessities, because finite natures do not always bring about their proper results. So that it is not an absolute necessity that an oak tree yield acorns. You can have a bad year and the oak tree doesn't yield acorns. But what you don't have in the oak tree is a potency in its own nature to decide between making acorns and not making acorns. In a rational creature as a will, you have multiple potency. You have a potency to one and a potency to another. You can quote that from 17th century Reformed theologians. You can quote it from a handbook on Thomist metaphysics, or Scotus metaphysics too. And Edwards doesn't have that. He's not reading that way anymore.
Can you help us make concrete what you're teaching us about old Calvinist theology by explaining the ways in which older Calvinists would have wanted to talk scholastically about the doctrine of irresistible grace? The reason I ask that question is because it's an interesting doctrine in Edwards' case. Edwards affirms it in a throwaway line, really, at the end of his treatise on freedom of will. But in a few places in his corpus, he suggests that it's kind of an ill-posed doctrine, because it seems to presume a contrary inclination in the part of the moral agent. To say that grace, saving grace is irresistible seems to presume that I would want to resist it, when in actuality what God does in converting us is change our affections, cause us to delight in the good, and so on and so forth. Most Edwardsians in the New England tradition in America thought that was an improvement on older Calvinist ways of talking about irresistible grace, because it seemed to be less deterministic, less coercive than Edwards' view. But according to the way you're trying to tell us about scholastic Calvinism, they weren't thinking well about that.
No.
So what's the best way to think about that?
No, I mean, there's a wonderful line. I mean, I sort of hate to say this to Calvinists, but that explains the way Orthodox Calvinism thought about this, and the line is, it's about Augustine, and it's found in Etienne Gilson's Spirit of Medieval Philosophy, he was a very good Thomist, by the way. Spirit of Medieval Philosophy, he comments that one of the presuppositions of Augustine's doctrine of predestination is human free choice, the freedom of will. And you ask, well, now, why in the world is that so? Why would a person like Augustine, with his very strong doctrine of election, and I would say reprobation, in some places anyway, and this notion of predestination, why would free choice be a presupposition? Well, Augustine assumed, as much of the older tradition assumed, including 16th, 17th century Protestants, that the will is fundamentally incoercible. Now, how would you coerce the human will if you wanted to bring about salvation? Well, you would bring those people into a revival service and say to them that if you do not come forward immediately today, you will be damned to hell forever. That's coercion, writ large. Now, if you ask a non-Augustinian type what's happening in that revival service, their response is, yes, those people are being shaken in their boots and brought forward, dragged forward. They're being coerced. The Augustinian says, no. What's actually happening there is that in the preaching in that service, God's grace worked on their will, changed their will, regenerated their will, so that they willingly come forward. It's the same phenomenon explained in two different ways. And the Augustinian way assumes, 17th century Reformed Orthodox way assumes, that when they say grace is irresistible, they don't mean that you're trying to resist it and you can't. They simply mean that it gets, in a sense, it's getting under the will. It's, well, I mean, I think it was Irenaeus who used the phrase with regards to the Lord's Supper, a medicine of immortality.
So the teaching
It's healing.
is very similar,
Teaching is similar.
because Edwards is using Augustinian language to affirm pretty much the same thing. He just doesn't like the word contingency, because for him, contingency means that in actuality, something really could have turned out differently. And it seems to him that the older Calvinist doctrine, or it seems to others who have interpreted him in relation to the older Calvinist doctrine, say, that for the older Calvinists, things aren't really contingent in the way Edwards defines contingency for the old Calvinists.
In the older Calvinist view, I think I'm right when I say that you have to hook the language of irresistible grace up with the language of perseverance and recognize that it's God's grace that is persevering to the end for the individual. But along the way to that end, the individual can turn in any number of different directions, and free choice is operative that way. What would you say about a Reformed theologian who makes the point that we are absolutely predestined to faith, but conditionally predestined to salvation? On
The
grounds of
condition being faith.
Being faith. Now, that happens to be William Twiss, who's a well-known supralapsarian. And the sense is that there has to be some activity going on in the human being after grace where the human being is freely moving in the right direction.
Hans?
I just wanted to try something a little dangerous and see if I could save Edwards a little bit. And
You don't need to save him.
and I wanted to try it this
He's
way.
probably
I wanted to try it this way and think, someone on the debate between Calvin and the Calvinists, someone suggested that the Calvinist continuity versus discontinuity, that the Calvinists were in continuity with the later Calvinists were in continuity with Calvin, but they had a different context and were contextualizing Calvin's thoughts, so to speak, in their own era. So I was wondering, potentially, what would you think about this argument that Edwards, perhaps because he was a modern theologian, didn't really buy into the whole Aristotelian world picture and some of the metaphysical assumptions, so those were discarded or marginalized in his thought, but in terms of the substance of his Reformed predecessors on the questions that you've been talking about, he was actually in fundamental agreement. And so that another way to interpret some of what you're saying is that perhaps Edwards was in continuity with the early reformers, but was simply trying to restate the substance of their thinking in a non-Aristotelian context. And so there isn't really this discordant sort of discontinuity that perhaps some people heard in your talk, but actually there's a continuity if you kind of take into account those larger metaphysical assumptions. What do you think about that?
I would certainly say that Edwards works very hard to maintain fundamental teachings of the Reformed tradition on into the 18th century. And I mean, I sort of jokingly said, I don't decide on orthodoxy and heresy because I'm not a synod, which of course is true. Only synods make those decisions. And none ever declared Edwards a heretic. William Hamilton did. He didn't have synodical authority. But I think in the midst of maintaining a whole battery of fundamental teachings of the Reformed faith, and in trying to maintain a radical sovereignty of God in salvation, in the context of a new Arminianism on free choice, Edwards does do something that's quite different. And I think where Hamilton is right, and where Priestley was right, was that the older Reformed theology was not a form of metaphysical determinism, and Edwards is. So there is a kind of discontinuity there. Now, on the other hand, sometimes what I say about continuity and discontinuity in Calvin and Calvinists gets misunderstood. I have never intended to be read as if I'm saying that 17th century Calvinists are in perfect continuity with Calvin. What I've tried to say from the beginning was that the Reformed tradition in its very origins was a rather diverse thing, and that you shouldn't be measuring the 17th century and the incredible battery of thinkers that are there in terms of their likeness to Calvin on all points. The continuity question has to do with standing inside the confessional framework that identifies what's Reformed. So that in Calvin's own time, Calvin, Bullinger, Musculus, Verbigli, any number of other thinkers can have considerable differences within a framework. 17th century, there are a lot more Reformed theologians in the 17th century than there were at the beginning of the Reformation. They just begin, particularly in the Netherlands, they begin to multiply like rabbits. And the more theologians you have, the more differences you will have among them. That's just the way systematicians are. And Reformed theology is diverse from its beginnings, and it stays diverse. By the time you get into the 18th century, one of the characteristic new diversities is that there is a stream that is trying to hold the older way that is not a matter of philosophical necessity, doesn't teach that. And there's another stream that is holding this other way. I seriously view George Hill and William Cunningham as significant counterpoises. And what's interesting is they all agree that Edwards is doing something rather different from what you can easily find. Cunningham would like it to be more similar, but he can't find it easily himself. the fact that it's different doesn't necessarily create a kind of discontinuity that throws him outside of the confessionality. I think it adds a new wrinkle to the philosophy, and as a result, we've got different strains here. A good article to read on this is the one that I mentioned by Sean Lucas. What was it? The title is even less complimentary than mine. The title runs.
Cutting it up from the root.
Yeah. That's Guelzo. Yeah, where is it? Yeah, he cuts up Edwardsism by the roots. Robert Louis Dabney and the Edwardsian Legacy in 19th Century South. One of the really significant thinkers in there is John Lafayette Girardot, who goes hammer and tongs after Edwards for not being like the older Calvinist tradition. So there's a lot of sensibility of that at the time. And for myself, no, I don't think he's stepped outside the confessionality. Although it's a tricky business, as Cunningham illustrates, to say just how confessional he is. And yes, the older Aristotelianism isn't working in the 18th century. The only person who thinks it does work is a fellow named James Burnet, Lord Monboddo, who wrote a whole set of books on the ancient philosophy in which he plasters everybody in his century and tries to uphold Aristotle. He only managed to publish this stuff because he was a Scottish lord, had all the time on his hands that he needed to write it, and then he paid for it himself. But he's sitting there at the end of the 18th century saying Aristotle was right all along. But lonely fellow, very lonely fellow. A little crazy, too.
A couple more questioners. Why don't we take David next?
My question, what significance do you see that Hamilton was a philosopher and Cunningham a theologian? Is there some difference in the way that they're thinking about, as one is approaching more theology, and Edwards himself, who's foremost a theologian? Is there some difference in the way that they're understanding these concepts that plays a role in this discussion? Is there some significance in this?
I don't think so. I think the older theological tradition pretty much demanded that its major thinkers be philosophically adept. Hamilton, like Stewart, and like Thomas Reed, were trying to uphold. I mean, Reed actually says in one of his volumes that this older understanding that there is an overarching providence and divine foreknowledge must be upheld, as must be the notion of human free choice, but it's an awfully difficult thing to do these days, and he even admits he doesn't quite know how to do it. So the philosophers are having trouble with it. What Hamilton is actually trying to do, and what Cunningham doesn't like, is Hamilton is dabbling as a theologian. What I would see Hamilton doing is trying to uphold an older tradition that is having increasing difficulty arguing its case. And Cunningham, Edwards, and Thomas Chalmers are on the other side of the Reformed tradition, where they're saying, well, we can argue a good philosophical case this way. So I don't think it's a matter between philosophers and theologians. I think it's a recognition of what do you do with this tradition, given that here we are in the middle of, in their case, the 19th century, and it's been over 100 years, probably 150, since this older language has been functional.
Mr. Gansky. Chris Gansky from Marquette. I wonder, I struggled to put my finger on the distinction or the difference of the Edwardsian piety or spirituality that you kind of get, what we sometimes call experimental piety. And I wonder if this distinction between the older Reformed understanding of the will and choice and the Edwardsian one is a factor at all in the way that you just have just when you read Calvin and the early Reformed tradition, the understanding of piety, I think, is somewhat different. Not absolutely, but I guess I wonder if there's a relationship there that you would see.
I would tend to think that Edwards' piety, that effective piety, has much clearer roots in 17th century Puritanism then his doctrine of freedom of will has roots in 17th century Reformed theology. Now, whether that actually then coheres, I don't know. I'm not enough of an Edwards reader to say whether I think that totally fits together. But no, I think his piety is very strongly in continuity with that experiential, experimental tradition, which is very effective.
Is there one more question? Looks like there may be.
I want to preface this that I think this is a fascinating topic and it's interested me for years. So I don't mean any disrespect at all by this question, but I think that all teaching should have practical application. And so I wondered, what this discussion means for the ordinary Christian in his daily life. What can I take away from this? And tomorrow when I drive into East Garfield Park and work with, the homeless in the inner city, what is the practical application for this?
I could certainly give you a good sense. I'd say I have this problem of being a historian, and I've worked my head back into the 17th century to the point that I'm not sure whether it works all that well in the 21st. But on the basis of what I would call 17th century understandings of free choice, you definitely have something you can use there. You certainly can't use Aristotelian technical language in urban mission. But what you can do is make very clear, if you want to do it in a religious way, that yes, we do talk about the sovereignty of God's grace to change human beings, but in doing that, we're not removing free choice. We're definitely not saying that we're not antinomians, in other words. We're not saying that if you are saved, it doesn't matter how you behave, because you're going to be saved anyway. And if you're not saved, well, go ahead. It doesn't matter how you behave either. No, whether you're saved or not saved, it does matter how you behave. And you do have free choice in a wide variety of matters. If somebody tells you you don't have absolute free choice, or you don't have free choice in saving yourself, that doesn't mean that you lack free choice in being a moral human being or in being able to make decisions for yourself. I think that's useful.
Well, we have really enjoyed. It's been a great treat for us to receive a typically erudite lecture from Richard Muller here at Trinity. Thank you very much for coming. Would you please join me in thanking Dr. Muller for his lecture? We'll stick around for just a few minutes in case anybody would like to speak personally with Dr. Muller.